Hey guys, this is our lesson on gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are called naked seed plants. They are a vascular plant and they're characterized by cones and needles. So here we are with our gymnosperms. So you can see the little tree we've been working our way through. We started with our non-vascular plants, the mosses, and those are closely related to the algae as the ancestor of all modern land plants. Then we flipped over to the vascular plants. And remember that vascular plants are plants that have xylem and phloem, those vascular elements that transport water through true roots, stems, and leaves to help the plant adapt and survive in a terrestrial environment. We've looked at the seedless vascular plants, which were the ferns, and now we're over here in the seed plants. So we've got gymnosperms, and then our last section will be on the angiosperms. So gymno means naked, just like gymnasium, where the first athletes competed bare bum naked, and sperm means seed. So gymnosperms are naked seed plants, which means there's no fruit or protective or nourishing covering over the plant. It includes the familiar pine trees, Christmas trees, but also things like ginkgos, cycads, netophytes, and conifers. The seeds are not enclosed by the ovary of the plant, and they're found on cones. These were the very first seed plants. Like all plants, they display alternation of generations, and they are sporophyte dominant. To help them with their life on land, they have many features. They have secondary growth, which is the xylem that allows them to grow thicker and get a greater support system so they can grow taller, higher up, closer to the sun for optimal photosynthesis. They do have seeds, which are enclosed by a protective covering, even though it's not inside a fruit. They use pollen to transport the male gametes, so they're less reliant on water. They have needles that help minimize water loss, strong woody roots as storage and support, and they also rely on wind to disperse their pollen. So lots of things going for them in a terrestrial environment. They're also very ecologically important. We know that in BC, our forests are full of gymnosperms, and this is a major part of BC's economy through logging, pulp and paper, building materials, very important for us that way. But they're also ecologically important. They're a habitat and a food source for many animals. They're a major carbon sink, so they do remove a ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there are medicinal properties as well. We know that ginkgo helps with memory and concentration. Yew is a promising anti-cancer drug used in chemotherapy. We know that pine and other conifers have been a source of vitamin C for generations as people arrived here and needed to get some vitamin C to help. They were making tea out of pine to solve their scurvy problems. We also know that our local Indigenous communities value many of the conifers around here, particularly cedar, as it is rot resistant, great for carving, for canoes, and the bark can be stripped off for weaving. Like all plants, we've got a bit of a complicated life cycle going through gametophyte and sporophyte generations. So we can see here the tree part that you're most familiar with is the mature sporophyte. And a tree bears two types of cones. There's the ovulate cone, which is the larger cone. This looks a little familiar. This is definitely not so familiar, but still these are both ovulate cones. These are the ones that bear the female gametes. They're also on every gymnosperm, the male cones, the pollen-bearing cones. And so these probably look a little less familiar. You might have thought maybe they were just young cones, but these are the sort of crumbly, small cones that are typically clustered at the ends of branches. So these cones and these cones both are from the same plant. On the pollen-bearing cones and on the ovulate cones, the cells will undergo meiosis and mitosis as the microspores form the gametes. The pollen grains contain sperm, and a megaspore contains the developing egg. So remember that when we're dividing up a life cycle, we can separate the two halves of the generation by connecting meiosis and fertilization. So we can see the red and blue sides of this life cycle. Pollen grains travel through the air with gymnosperms. They are wind dispersed, and they end up landing on the scales, these little open bracts of the female cone, and traveling down to fertilize the egg on the cone itself. Then a seed develops and then is released, falls to the ground, and germinates to the next generation's sporophyte. Typically, they are monoecious, which means that they're both sexes contained on the same plant. And heterosporous means that they are producing different looking spores. There are male spores different than female spores. We use the word microspore and megaspore to denote the difference between the male and female spores. So a male cone, if we were to take one of these little cones and slice it longitudinally, put it under a microscope, this is what we would see. Here's that woody central stalk, and then these are all the little scales of the cone. Within each cone is a sporangium. We've seen that word already with moss and ferns. Here it is again. In this case, we're calling it a microsporangium because it contains the developing microspores, which will eventually turn into pollen. These tiny little scales on the cone, that is the gametophyte generation there. Here we have the pollen, and we can see that there's a sort of Mickey Mouse shape to it. These wings help for dispersal through wind, and there are 4 cells within a pollen grain. 2 of those are going to develop into sperm and will be delivered to the egg through a pollen tube. 1 sperm will fertilize 1 egg. It's a single fertilization event. And that will become clear why that's emphasized now when we look at angiosperms, which undergo double fertilization. On the female cones, like this guy, girl, this one. Again, if we slice them longitudinally, put them under a microscope, we can see the bracts or scales of a cone. And at the base of each one, we'll find the developing ovule. The ovule develops around a megaspore. Contains the female sporangium and the female gametophyte, which eventually will produce the egg. Now here we can see pollination and fertilization. And those are actually 2 different events. Pollination is the movement of pollen from the male pollen-producing structures through the air, in this case, to the female receptacles, the cones. Fertilization is the actual fusion of sperm and egg. And so those are related terms, but not the same step. Once the ovule has become fertilized, it develops into a gymnosperm seed. And that seed, if you remember those little helicopters, they come off the scales of these plants and fall to the ground for germination. So those are the 3 steps of the gymnosperm life cycle. We've got pollination, fertilization, and germination. Pollen moving from male parts to female parts. Fertilization is the egg and sperm actually fusing, and then germination is this developed seed growing up into a seedling. We've got lots of diagrams here. Again, here, this one looks a little bit more like this giant cone here. Sometimes this plant is called the widowmaker. This is a really heavy cone, and if it were to fall out and conk someone on the head, certainly it would cause some serious damage, likely even death. It's a big, big cone. Little video for you here about seed production in gymnosperms. Pay attention to the differences between fertilization, pollination, and germination.
A pine is a common conifer found all over the northern hemisphere. It can be used as a model for the seed production process in all gymnosperms. The adult sporophyte, the pine tree, develops male and female cones on separate branches. Female cones develop 2 ovules on the upper surface of each cone scale. Each ovule contains haploid megaspores. Male cones produce microspores by meiosis. The microspores develop into pollen grains. Each winged pollen grain is a 4-celled male gametophyte. The female gametophyte grows, producing 2 or more archegonia, each of which contains an egg. During pollination, a wind-borne pollen grain falls near the opening in one of the ovules of the female cone. Each male gametophyte forms a pollen tube that penetrates the tissue of the female gametophyte. When the pollen tube has grown into the archegonium, a sperm cell from the male gametophyte fertilizes the egg. The zygote develops into an embryo and a mature seed is produced. The female cone opens, releasing the seeds. When conditions are favorable, the seed germinates into a new, young sporophyte, a pine tree seedling.